Hi everyone, this is Sandra again with the DiscoveryLab, another DiscoveryLab session. And today I'm talking to Rob Clemens, who is actually working on the Powerful Owl project. It's a very, very fascinating area that he's studying. It's a citizen science project as well. So I'm very glad he's here with us today. And I'll let Rob, he works with actually Birdlife Australia doing this project. So I'll let Rob introduce himself and tell us all about yourself, Rob, and about your career and where it started and how. Welcome.
Thanks. So let's see, about a few years ago now, I spent about 10 years studying raptors in the US after my undergraduate degree, and got a master's in Humboldt University studying these things called red-shouldered hawks, which are, you should look them up online, they're very striking, very stunning birds. Then I came to Australia for a year, and that was about 15 years ago. And so we've liked it and we've stayed. And I was with BirdLife working on shorebirds for about 15 years. Got a PhD at UQ studying shorebird ecology. And now I've slipped back into raptors, which is something I'm really passionate about. And forest raptors in particular, because they occupy these beautiful forests, which I'm very fond of walking around in.
That's very interesting. So where has your love for birds begun? Like, were you a kid and just wandering the forest and really fascinated with birds, or how did it all happen for you?
Yeah, no, I was pretty oblivious to birds as a kid. I grew up in Germany, and we spent a lot of time in the outdoors, but wildlife wasn't a big part of our life there. And then when I was an undergraduate, I had a semester abroad in the University of South Australia. So I came here many years ago, and as an undergrad, and we tromped around the Mallee, so a place called Dangali Conservation Area, and we were doing this survey on just about anything, so bugs, birds, plants, for a couple of weeks, and bouncing all around South Australia doing other field work. And during that time, I got to, every morning, we had to choose a project. And my project was going out every morning and following around these striated grass wrens. And there was a family, a group of about 10 of them that you could get onto every morning. And I did behavioral observations. And that just kind of tuned me into birds for the first time. And incidentally, I've never been able to see striated grass wrens like that in the wild ever since, in the 15 years that I've been here since. But anyway, that turned me on to birds, and went back and discovered there were birds back where I lived. And there used to be some prairie dog towns outside of town and within town. And these big hawks would capture prairie dogs, and the bald eagles come in and they scare away the hawk in order to get the bald eagle, or in order to get the prairie dog. So a bald eagle can't catch a prairie dog to save its life, but it can steal a prairie dog. Anyway, all that got me interested in raptors. So, long story.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I love those stories. They really set a scene for, how a person develops this interest into the science that they do, or whatever it is that they do. So with these powerful owls, you worked with seashore birds as well, and then you got into, when did you start working on the powerful owls themselves?
Powerful owl was only about 3 years ago. Kind of dipped my toe in the water a little bit, and really only for the last couple of years that I've been heavily involved in the project again. So it's fairly new to me. And I studied raptors in the States, and owls are very easy to find in the States in comparison to powerful owls. They're much more vocal. So I could go out in the woods and I could just go, hoo hoo, and half the owls in the woods would respond to me. And if I went there maybe 5 times, I'd know pretty much who was there. But here, that's not the case at all. So you can go out 20 times to an area, and one of those 20 visits, you might hear the powerful owl. And they don't necessarily like to call back. So they're much more secretive here. They're much more elusive. Well, especially the powerful owl. The boo-books you hear all the time, some owls are more vocal, but powerful owl, for whatever reason, very quiet. So we didn't know really where it is in Queensland. And have a good understanding where they're found. And when we started the project, we had we thought 50 pairs or so in Southeast Queensland was our best guess. And already after a couple of years, we think maybe at least 150, if not 300 pairs in Southeast Queensland. So we're really, when you start looking for an elusive bird, you tend to find more of them. And that's what's been happening. So that's been exciting.
Yeah, but it seems like there's not that many. I mean, because they're elusive, that's one reason for it. But they're also threatened, aren't they? Like, why? How threatened are they? And yeah, is it just now that you're starting to they're being looked for, or do you know that the populations have been decreasing over time?
Yep. So they've been listed as threatened in all 3 states where they occur. So Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. And they're generally east of the ranges, so they're not in the outback or out in the drier country. They're in the ranges primarily and towards the coast. And they were all listed because, we've lost over half of our forest habitat, over the preceding decades. And, with this summer's bushfires, it looks like maybe 30% of forest owl habitats were impacted by those fires. So we're not real clear what that translates to in terms of population real precisely, but huge impacts for not just powerful owl, but greater sooty owl, masked owl. So species that some of them we weren't as worried about are probably on the worried radar now, all because of one summer's, of fire. And then deforestation rates in Queensland. If you're familiar with Martin Taylor's work from WWF, he's highlighted how our rates of deforestation in Queensland are, second to none. For an industrialized country, we're clearing more woods than just about anybody, and that's where these birds live. So if anything, they're becoming a little more threatened. They're also threatened. So they're threatened by habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. They require a 200 to 500-year-old tree to nest in. So for whatever reason, they won't nest in a nest box. There's one example of that happening somewhere, but generally they don't nest in a nest box. So you need this massive old tree. And there's just fewer and fewer of those around. So that's probably the main reason that they're increasingly threatened, is you're losing both forest habitat and those big old trees that they need. They don't tend to nest in one that's completely dead. There has to be a bit of life in it still. So there'll still be a bit of leaves and a nice big Winnie the Pooh sized hollow, window that they use. But the other things that they're threatened by, so there's a campaign currently to get rid of some rat baits that you can buy in the grocery store or you can buy at Bunnings. And BirdLife has a campaign to look at, you can just put in a submission, and we make it real easy for folks. But these compounds that we're selling, they're called second generation anticoagulant rat poisons. And in the EU, in the United States, and Canada, you can't buy them over the counter. But for whatever reason here in Australia, you can. And there's a study out of Southwest WA that suggests that maybe, a fair number of boo-book owls were killed, had lethal levels of this toxin in their system. So there's really no reason to, we can do other things to control rats, and seems like a simple step to regulate this poison. So that's one thing that's on the front burner. And then the other thing we worry about with urban owls, so the cool thing about powerful owls is they've moved into urban areas. Like 20 years ago, if you talked to me and said, where do powerful owls live? I would have told you they live in these majestic old growth forests that are really, magical. But over the last couple of decades, they've moved increasingly into our suburbs. And they're just taking advantage of all the possums that are available to eat. So as long as they can find that old growth tree, they can breed. Sometimes they're occupying forests without breeding because there aren't any old growth trees there. And it looks like there's a price to living in the city. So if you live in the city, you're more likely to die at a younger age due to collision or electrocution or things that you don't run into in those nice old majestic forests. So, sorry, I'm rambling.
And also, I guess, the rat poison as well in the cities. So, people are more likely probably to use these chemicals as well, I would assume. And so have there been studies on how it's hard to study powerful owls, aren't they? Like you're saying, they're elusive. And can there be owls that are found, or other owls that are found, powerful owls specifically, and is there a link between the poison and the owls as well? Like, is it just book owls or owls in general that people have studied so far?
So far, the only Australian study has been done on boobook owls. There's been studies that have looked at other raptors and things overseas. And generally, it increasingly is thought to be pretty widespread throughout the food chain. So it's a very persistent, compounds in the environment. They don't go away very quickly. And they're finding them in things like possums, and they're finding them. So we would think that it would be less of an issue for powerful owl because they eat fewer rats and rodents. There's a few pairs in Sydney that have switched to eating rats, but generally powerful owls are eating arboreal prey, so things that live in trees. So we think it's probably less of an issue for them, more of an issue for things like barn owls and boobook owls in particular, and a lot of other raptors. But nobody's really done the work to see, how prevalent it is throughout the food chain throughout Australia. Most of the real rigorous work has been done in this one study in Southwest WA. But we know in other parts of the world, they just got rid of this compound years ago. You don't sell it over the counter. So it's really odd that that you can just go to your local hardware store, your grocery store, and buy this stuff. It's really nasty. Anyway.
Yes, it makes me wonder about the regulations and why these poisons end up on the shelf so readily, and how many children could also swallow them, babies, toddlers walking around. Like, it just shouldn't be in the ecosystem at all.
Yeah.
And in terms,
in the States, it's not allowed to be used in homes. You're not allowed to use it domestically at all. So it's really strange.
yes, it is. And it's the interesting thing also about these owls, as I've listened to some of your presentations now, seems to be that they're also predating now rabbits and other animals. Possums, rabbits, there was a few other things. And it's kind of cool because I can imagine that these raptors, when allowed, and other owls as well, when they're allowed to roam and when their habitat is increased, then rodent poison is no longer needed because you have these animals that are actually adapting to eat. And, these animals that we don't love as much, and therefore the populations are naturally then in balance, it feels like, if we create the conditions for these animals. Would you say that's the case?
It can be. So, urban ecology is fascinating, right? You've got this new environment where things do better or worse, and rats do better. Powerful owls are figuring out how to exploit that that prey resource. But certainly, here in Queensland, we don't have as many rats around the house, probably because we have a lot of carpet pythons in our ceilings and and a lot of other things, and owls and other things that sort of control those rodent populations. Whereas in other parts of the country, rats are a bigger I mean, maybe they're a bigger issue for other people in Queensland, but they certainly, none of them around here. And I know we got a couple of carpet pythons around, so that probably helps. And a powerful owl that comes to the yard as well. So, but again, powerful owls, they're only starting to eat rats and rabbits and things that live on the ground in a couple of sites in New South Wales, as far as we know. So we haven't really done the prey work here in Queensland, so maybe they are switching to those things here as well. But generally, you see them during the day and they'll be perched with a prey item. And it's usually a possum, sometimes a bird, sometimes a flying fox, but usually things that are found in the trees.
Interesting. And so did you say you have a powerful owl in your backyard?
Well, he visits, you know, or he and she, they both visit. And they usually visit in March and April, and they're nesting about 500 meters from the house. So they're nesting in a reserve. So not too far away. And then there's another pair in the other direction from the house. And sometimes at night you can hear them sort of talking to each other, drawing the lines, I guess, between their territories probably.
And is this in Brisbane? You live in Brisbane, or?
Yeah, so I'm in the Gap.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. And there's more around than we thought. So I think, you know, they make that real distinctive hoo-hoo call, which, you know, the boo-book is more like a boo-book, right? It's much sharper, much shorter notes. And that real distinctive woo-hoo call, nothing else makes it. It sounds like an owl. And as soon as people are kind of tuned into it, they can just let us know about it, you know, through the project or through bird data or whatever it might be. So that's helping a lot. A lot of people know where these birds are. And once they learn how to recognize that call at night, we're getting a lot more sightings coming in. So that's good.
Yeah, that's really cool. And just a little bit to find out a little bit more about these owls. They're quite large, aren't they? They're like something like 65 centimeters big, the females. So they're quite...
Yeah, that's a lot of owl.
Yeah, and that makes it difficult for them to find nests, isn't it? To find nesting sites, because the trees are getting removed. So we have this issue where these giant birds can no longer be sustained in the current habitats that we're leaving for them. And also, you mentioned in some of your talks that they won't nest readily in boxes. Obviously, boxes are hard to make that size. Is that one of the reasons?
Yeah, so I have 3 years ago, before I knew any better, I built a dishwasher-sized nesting box and put it out in the tree in the backyard. And it's about 25 meters up, and you know, it was a lot of work to get it up there and to make it. I actually had somebody make it here in town, but you know, a big operation. And it's great for possums. There's a cute little family of possums that live there now. But yeah, powerful owls just don't use that kind of artificial hollow. There's one example in the literature of it working. So there's a variety of reasons for that. But yeah, you're right. You need about a 35 centimeter hole in the side of a tree, and that hollow needs to be, it's usually a meter deep. Sometimes it's 2 meters deep. So you need a really big tree to create that kind of hollow, much bigger than a lorikeet hollow or something that you might see. So big trees, usually.
You've also mentioned in there that there was this problem that is potential there, that the decomposition of the waste that the owls produce may not happen in a closed system, but may be possible in a system like a tree hollow, and makes me wonder whether there's some sort of a, you know, a fall through as well, and they choose those sites based on the fact that it can be cleaned from the inside. And you've also mentioned decomposers possibly having, like fungi, having the role in that. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, don't know. But what I do know is, I haven't done this yet, but people who crawl into a hollow a couple of days after the birds have left, that hollow is clean and it's spotless, you know? And that's pretty remarkable, because there's been a female that's lived in there for 2 months, and then she's raised chicks. Those chicks have lived in there for 2 months. So she's been in there for the first month while the kids are young, and the kids grow up in there. So they're pooing and eating for 2 months, and they're quite, by the time they leave, they're almost half a meter in size. So it's a lot of bird, a lot of prey that they'd be eating, a lot of, poo and pellets and all kinds of things that should be in there, but there just isn't anything when you go in there. So, I assume there's some kind of, microecology that's breaking things down. And that might be a missing ingredient from the nest boxes. And the other thing is the microclimate would be much more stable. So they're a winter breeder. So most of them are on eggs now in May. And so they like that little warm hole, and it also doesn't get too hot in the sun. Whereas the nest box, has it can be really cold or really hot. So those are two things that we think might be issues. I also kind of think they tend to prefer, some birds get a search image in their head and they just can't reconcile something else. So something that looks a little more natural, I think, might go over well. So that's 3 things that might work. There's a lot of people trying a lot of things. And if we do find something that works, we could put up these hollows in forests where we know the birds are hanging out, but there's just no breeding hollows, so they're not breeding.
That's very interesting. There's so many questions I have. Like, for example, like how many baby birds does a mum have and dad have? Do they mate for life? Is that what they do?
So, well, every time we study this, right, except for albatross, you think they mate for life, and then you find out, well, maybe not so much. We do think they mate for life, but there haven't been a lot of good studies to really verify that. They usually have 2 kids, so usually lay 2 eggs. Usually those 2 eggs will hatch. Sometimes you'll get 3, sometimes you'll just get 1, usually 2. And again, they grow up inside that hollow for a couple of months, and then, at about 6, 7, 8 months of age, they get kicked out of the territory. So they'll hatch in July-ish. There's a kind of big window on when they might hatch. They could hatch anytime from July through to September. But then when they grow up, they'll get kicked out of the territory in about March. So the parents will tell them they have to leave at, only 6 months of age. They got to make their way in the world, which is pretty impressive. Got to figure it out rather quickly.
Yeah, and what is their range, like the territorial range? How far does a huge owl like that reach?
Yeah, so it can be quite far. So they can fly 10 kilometers a night to go get food. And there's pairs in Sydney where you see that. And there's pairs, it seems like a lot of the pairs that are further out in the bush in more natural habitats have bigger home ranges. But if you have a lot of prey around, if you have a lot of possums, their home range can shrink and it can be quite small. So there are places in New South Wales and in Victoria where breeding pairs are only 500 meters apart. So usually they're going to be 2 to 5 and maybe even 10 kilometers apart. But if there's a lot of prey available, you can have a much higher breeding density of these birds. So it really varies, just depends on how much there is to eat, really.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating subject, to study these animals or any animal in the wild. One of the things I've noticed as well, you were speaking about in one of your presentations, were like this problem of deforestation and also studying only natural areas. And now you're venturing out into this, how can we protect private land if we know there are owls, and what is the significance of private landholdership? How does that impact how these owls are living, and also how the land is protected for them? Yeah, just anything on the land-based issues that we could address.
Yep. Yeah, so I think a lot of us have, been struggling for years and years and years to try and figure out how to conserve more habitat generally, right? And that's certainly true in forest ecology. There's a lot of pressures on forests from development. So you've got 1,000 people moving to Southeast Queensland every month. So there's a lot of forest that's cleared for housing. A lot of the forest that's cleared for Queensland as a whole is cleared for agriculture. So those pressures are always going to carry a lot of weight in the planning process. And a lot of times we don't even know where these species are. That's been true with the powerful owl in Queensland for a long time. Certainly true for other species as well. Some of the gliders, yellow-bellied glider and greater glider, we don't have a good understanding of where these animals live, and they're threatened species. So often it comes pretty late in the piece that you figure out that they might be there, and sometimes you might not even figure it out. In the case of powerful owl, you could easily clear an area of powerful owl and they would have just flown off, and you wouldn't have picked them up because they're very hard to find. So part of what we do is try and predict where they are in the landscape. And you can do that. So there's, these machine learning algorithms that are very, they work very well compared to what was around 10, 20 years ago. And so you can make very good predictions based on the kinds of habitats that are available in the landscape of where you're going to find these birds. And if you get one that's accurate enough, then you can give that information to planners and managers. And you might be able to get that incorporated into a state planning layer, which can help. In Queensland, it would be ideal if you could get that thing put into a city plan. Council plans carry a lot of weight. And interestingly, the environment is usually not a big element of council plans and legal decisions around planning of infrastructure and other things. It's usually other bits of the law that come to bear on local planning decisions, and a lot of those are based within the council and at the council level. So you often end up in a situation where, there's a development application, and then, after the fact, you're kind of picking up the pieces and trying to identify, well, there's birds here, or there's biodiversity assets here, whatever it might be. And what we'd like to do with the Powerful Owl project is get some of those planning layers a little more cemented in the state planning schemes, so that you're on the front foot when you're doing planning and other things. So at least if you're making decisions about an area, you're aware that there are likely powerful owls in the area, or greater gliders, or whatever it might be. So that's what we do. We're also looking to get them. They're not listed yet federally under EPBC legislation. We're looking to put that case together over this year for powerful owl, greater sooty owl, and mast owl. But that can be a long process, and it's also something that's usually not, it's something you're usually doing on the side. So it's not something that's usually one of your paid activities, I guess. But all of those things together should help, but it's a real challenge, and that's true in conservation generally. It's always, it's a lot of work, but the information helps. So every time we find a powerful owl, and every time we find a powerful owl breeding area in particular, if we find a breeding hollow, that carries a lot more weight, no matter where you are in that process. Within the current system, it carries more weight than if you just say, well, there's some big trees in the area. If you have a threatened species that's popped up, that, again, it's not a sure thing that it's going to protect an area, but it sure helps.
Mm. And in terms of people, how essential is it for people with the land to sort of because private land is not protected at all usually. So what can people with land that, even know that they have these owls, or even just because they want to protect the landscape and because it's land for wildlife or what can we do?
Yep. So the Land for Wildlife program is a great one. And it's probably taken off more in Southeast Queensland than just about anywhere, because it's got a bit of, councils have come on board with a bit of funding. There's a bit of coordination. So that program just encourages you to retain biodiversity values on your land, basically. And recognizing when you have biodiversity that's important on your land is an important step in that process. So just figuring out what's on your property is a big step, and then figuring out what steps you need to take, or what steps you could take to retain that biodiversity. And in the case of powerful owls, it's obviously retaining those big old trees on your place and trying to avoid clearing as much as you can. There was a study in Victoria that noted that some powerful owl pairs, not all of them, but some pairs, 2/3 of the time that they're in the landscape, they're outside of the reserve system. So they're in private properties. So if we were to lose all of that habitat on private properties, you'd lose a lot of threatened species. You'd lose a lot of powerful owls. So the reserve system is a big part of how we conserve things, but the reserve system is relatively small. So you have to partner with private landholders and encourage, whether it's farmers or whether it's just, people who have a nice big bush block to do their best with the property. And for powerful owls, it's fairly simple. You retain the forest and you retain the hollow-bearing trees. Trees also provide habitat for the prey. So, a glider, for example, a greater glider or a yellow-bellied glider might use a dozen hollows, so they don't just use one hollow, they're bouncing around from hollow to hollow. So, retaining all those things is important. Weeds and other things are important for other species, probably less important for powerful owl, but again, there's very important to do things on private properties as well, and to try and increase the reserve, the size of the reserve system. So.
And with your citizen science project, where you're obviously asking people to go out there and look for these owls, is that a good way of going forward as well, getting people interested in joining the citizen science project, going out there and having a look at what's in their areas, adopting a piece of area that they, how does it work, and what are the, tricks of the trade in becoming a citizen scientist in this area of powerful owl research?
Yep, so it's not too complicated. So we've got a variety of resources that you can find on the Powerful Owl website, and you can reach out to us and you can get involved informally. There's some videos that kind of tell, what the project's about, how to find the birds, all these kinds of different things. And you can also just enter the data in bird data. So informally, it's quite easy to participate. If you're out and about at night and you hear that woo-hoo call, you just put in the details of that sighting in our online database, which is bird data. And that gets straight to me, and I can see what people are seeing in different areas. If you sign up formally, then you get a map of where sightings have been in an area. You might get contacts of other people who are working in that area. If you're lucky, you'll be next to a place where we know there's a breeding hollow. And so checking on those is much easier than finding them. Finding them can take a lot of work. But generally, we ask people do about an hour-and-a-half walk at dusk. So around sunset, you take a walk for an hour and a half once a week. And if you do that through the breeding season, you usually solve the mystery of where the powerful owls are breeding. So it's not too hard to participate. And the reason it works, if it was just me going out, I'd probably, maybe a dozen, maybe 20 Maybe over the years I'd get up to 30 pairs that I'd be able to keep track of. There is absolutely no way that I'd be able to keep track of 150 pairs of powerful owls. And the only reason we're able to do that is because we have lots of ears and eyes helping us in the forest. So it really, really makes a big difference when people get engaged. And increasingly, my job is less about walking around the woods and more about just coordinating things and doing the data and watching all this amazing data coming in, which is really awesome.
Yeah, that is so cool. And so in terms of this project is not only to do with the fact that, you know, you're going to spot the pair or hear the pair of owls, but also monitoring. Is that what you're saying? That it's actually monitoring over time what's happening with breeding pairs. However, could it also be that it's just to find the owls as well?
Yep. So there's opportunities to kind of be a pioneer and find out where the owls are on the landscape. And it takes a bit more work, you know, it takes a few more visits. And a lot of times you just have to be prepared to go out and not hear them. And you might see other things. You might see gliders, you might see, you know, sugar gliders or koalas or echidnas or platypus. I mean, it's cool what you get onto when you start surveying in the evenings. A lot of Australian wildlife is out at night, so the bandicoots are out. And anyway, but a lot of times you won't see powerful owls. They're very elusive, very quiet. So it's that routine of taking walks over and over again that eventually you'll get those cues that, oh, okay, the bird's probably here, it's probably breeding here. And then once you've figured out where they're breeding, yeah, we just go back every year and verify that they're still in the same hollow. Sometimes if they're not, it takes a bit of work to figure out what hollow they might have moved to. But oftentimes they'll use the same hollow for a decade or more. So once you've found the hollow, it's just a matter of going and checking on them and seeing how many young are produced. And it all gets much, much easier. And you can usually find the birds most times when you go out once you know where the hollow is. But until you know where the hollow is, oh, I tell you what, it can be a real challenge.
What are some of the other cues, not just seeing a hollow, but what are the cues people could look for if they're going out to look for these owls?
So the best one, and so now, you know, from May through June and July, if you go out at dusk, so maybe an hour before sunset, and walk anywhere to a couple hours after sunset, and a lot of times the birds will call right after sunset, but it could be anywhere in that sort of 3-hour period. And it's when they're just waking up. And at this time of year, the female's in that hollow, and she's been in there all day long. She's probably a little hungry. If she is hungry, she might crawl out of the hollow and call to the male, and you'll hear the male and female call back and forth. And it's where that female is calling at this time of year is usually right next to where the hollow is. And you can usually go back during the day, and the male will usually be perched outside the hollow. So he's usually, right, he's usually within eyesight, not always, you know, wildlife, but often he's perched within eyesight of the hollow. And then in July or August, depending on when the chicks have hatched and all that stuff, the female will pop out when the birds are about half grown. So they're, after a month, the female will pop outside the hollow, and she'll sit right next to the hollow and wait for those chicks to grow up for another month before the chicks emerge. And during that time, at dusk, if you're within earshot of the hollow and there's chicks around, you have a 95% chance of hearing the chicks trilling. They have this very distinctive trilling call that you can find online. And you'll hear that. And when they're really young, it's a real light trill. And as they get older and bigger and come out of the hollow, it gets louder. But for several months, most nights at dusk, you know, they've just woken up, and so they'll start trilling. So that's the using your ears is the secret at dusk. and then you do that follow-up visit during the day. And then as the season wears on, you'll see these cute white fluffy chicks outside the hollow, trilling at dusk. And you'll see them just perched there during the day. And yeah, so you can usually find them. They're still hard to see sometimes, but you can usually find them during the day. You don't need to go out at night necessarily once you know where the hollow is or where it might be.
Sounds like so much fun looking for these owls, and it must be so rewarding when you first, discover a hollow, or even just, when you get to see them, it must be so fantastic, or even hear them. In terms of the record on bird data, like how do people, can you describe a little bit bird data to us so we can get to know it a little bit and actually start using it?
Yep, so bird data is, it's a free app, so you can go to the App Store on your Apple or your Android phone and download it. And it's fairly intuitive to use. There's a little quiz, which, so if you download it and you enter records under the Powerful Owl Project, it'll ask you a series of questions if you're doing a breeding area survey. But otherwise, you don't necessarily have to do that. You could just put a general survey in. And you'll just, a map of where you're working will pop up on your phone, and you can just, double click on the map and it'll pop the location in there. And it just asks for a few details like the date, what time it was. There'll be a few other questions that pop up, and then you just enter Powerful Owl if you've seen one and how many you saw. So it's pretty simple to use. And then you can also just use it online. So birdlife.birddata.org.au has, you can log into it that way on your computer. And you can also edit your records there and do other things there that you can't do on the app. So the app is doesn't have as many things that you can do on it as the website does. But it's pretty easy to just take your phone out, and while you're doing a walk, you can record whatever birds you're seeing, not just Powerful Owl, but anything. So at BirdLife, much of what we do is reliant on the fact that thousands and thousands of people go out and record what birds they see. And those are really observable parts of biodiversity. And then we can take that data and really start to tease apart, well, where are the places in the landscape where birds are doing better? Where are the places where they're doing worse? What kinds of features do we need to retain some of the threatened species? All those kinds of questions we can explore, just because there's so many people just going out and recording the birds they see when they go for a walk.
So cool. It's so cool that technology these days is so available in the sense that it can become very almost addictive as a game, because people love the contribution of data, I feel, and it's such a great way to engage people in citizen science and creating the opportunity to actually do large-scale studies, as you said earlier, that you could not do on your own. And it's just such a wonderful thing to promote, I feel,
Yeah, no, it's none of it's possible without all the people that participate. So we've got 500 volunteers, over 500, that are signed up to the Powerful Owl Project currently. And it blows my mind what the amount of data and the quality of data that comes in just on this project. And then with BirdLife more generally, we're having thousands of surveys that are being put in just in Southeast Queensland all the time. So really, really sort of helps us uncover what's out there. So really useful.
So,
and also a good way to explore what's where,
Yeah.
So if you look at a certain bird, like a pitta or something, you can go to one of these online databases and see where other people have seen it.
So fascinating. What are some of the things you would like to say to our audience to encourage them to maybe get involved, or just some of the tips in terms of what they can do to help out in terms of even the way that we view, you know, our everyday life and how that impacts wildlife, and specifically the owls in this case.
Yeah. So one of the things we really like about the Powerful Owl Project is it is a very engaging species. It's not a tiger, but it's about as close as you're going to get in Brisbane. It's just a very impressive bird when you get onto it in Brisbane, right? There's not many kinds of wildlife that you're likely to see around town that are as impressive. And because of that, there's a lot more interest in these birds. And that allows us to talk about them to a much bigger audience than we would otherwise. So, you know, the media or other people will cover powerful owls because they're a flagship species, because they're a very engaging, attractive species with cute chicks, and people will be very engaged with that. And when that happens, we can start the dialogue about how we need to conserve forests, we need to conserve these big, massive trees in the landscape. We need to avoid rat poisons. We need to think about collision and electrocution, which are things we can try and manage a little bit for these birds. And they're a nice umbrella species. So powerful owl is going to require a big patch of woods. You know, the smallest patch of woods we've found so far in Southeast Queensland, I think, is about 35 hectares. But often it's more like 200 hectares of forest that they require. So it's a big patch of woods. And within a big patch of woods like that, you get all kinds of other critters running around, and flora and fauna that you wouldn't get in smaller bits of habitat. So I guess I would urge people that if you're at all interested in powerful owls, spread the word, spread the love. They're awesome species to get acquainted with, and they're pretty easy if you're willing to put in that, you know, walk once a week, you know, for a couple of months. You'll eventually get onto them. And it's really rewarding because, you know, it's one of those things you do have to spend a bit of time trying to find. And then eventually you'll find out, oh, well, they've been here all along, and I probably walked within 10 meters of these birds, you know, a dozen times before I finally found them. So it's very rewarding to find them, and they're awesome birds. So.
Yeah, they sound like such a treat. Are there specific trees that other species that they prefer, or is it just some trees are more likely to form hollows because of their age, or has there been any studies showing that they prefer certain trees?
Yeah, so any tree that has, you know, that huge hollow will work probably, but generally you see those in like blue gums or scribbly gums or gray gums. But it's usually the eucalypts, you know, the myrtles, you know, that you'll see that form those big hollows. You usually won't see them in, you know, a lot of the other trees. So it's usually those big old ukes.
Very interesting. Look, Rob, I really appreciate your time. This has been such an informative little discussion, and I just wanted to squeeze that last question in there, even though I was like, this is the end, but no. There are so many questions, and I know you've put out so many amazing videos and your own presentations on how to engage this project, the data about the owls that so far has been found. So we'll be sharing those, of course, and I'm assuming they'll be on YouTube soon as well. How else can we get in touch?
Yep, they are on YouTube.
What can we do to really get this sort of promoted?
Yep, so if you go to that Powerful Owl website, the videos are all there, linked to on YouTube. There's ways to get in touch with us. There's links to bird data. So all the stuff you need, if you just Googled Powerful Owl Project, it'll pop up, and there's reports and all kinds of stuff. And if you send me an email, maybe I'll run out to you or run into you in the woods.
Well, I certainly hope so. I really hope that Wood 40 is going to be one of our study sites. So as soon as this breeding season starts, would like to invite you so we can go and do a video of how to even, do this expedition on how we can look for these animals. And I know that you'd be glad to do that. So I'm really glad myself. Thank you so very much. Thank you for, thank you for today. And we'll be in touch soon. And hopefully we'll meet in person very soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra.
Bye. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All the best. See ya. All right, I'm going to stop.